What a powerful God we serve. And, there are times where we are reminded of that. And not trying to be self-degrading, but one of the things that I have to remind myself often is the fact that I am where I am because God has called me. That I am a pastor because I believe God specifically called me. And I remember that call very vividly. In 2003, I was at a Nazarene youth convention, a global youth convention called NYC, Nazarene Youth Convention, and they have it every 4 years. And we decided, or ours, I didn't decide, it was in Houston in July. There's a great place to be in July. And you had to do a service project while you were at the convention. And mine was all day in a park carrying bags of mulch around the entire park. I smelled real fresh after that. But anyway, so it was at NYC that I received my call. And I remember there was a service specifically, and they ended the service with an altar call for those who were called to ministry. Now, I hadn't received a call to ministry yet, so I kind of checked out of the service. I wasn't rude or belligerent or anything like that, but it was one of those things where, I haven't been called, so it's not to me. Kind of check out, wait for them to dismiss you from the service, and then go on your merry way. Well, they finally dismissed us, and I remember walking out, and I looked back at the stage, and I very specifically remember God said, "Jeff, that's what I want you to do." My response was, whatever, and kind of kept going. And the service was over, so there wasn't really much I could do right then, or at least so I reasoned. And so I just kind of kept going on with my life. Well, I never told anybody about that. About a year and a half, getting close to 2 years later, I had this moment with God. So I was getting ready to go to college, to go to Olivet Nazarene University. I'd already committed there. Everything was set. It was getting to the point where I needed to declare a major or go undecided. The problem is I knew what God had called me to be, but I hadn't told anybody yet. And so on a Sunday morning, at the end of the service, I just felt God come to me, and it was, "Jeff, you're either following me or you're not." And so I either needed to accept that call or not. And so I went down to the altar. I had a moment of prayer, and I went up front, and I told everybody I am called to the ministry. I publicly stated that. And from that moment is when I accepted the call, when it became real, and when I did something about it. And then I went to Olivet, Nazarene University, got a degree and all that kind of stuff. And so I accepted the call, and I did things to affirm God's call in my life. Probably one of the most famous calls, if not the most famous call in the Bible, is that of Moses. Moses had this moment where God called him, but really Moses shouldn't have probably been there in the first place. Moses was born in Egypt at a time where his people, the Hebrews, the Israelites, that they were to be killed. In order to save him, any baby boy that was born, that was Moses' age, was instructed to be killed right away. And so his mother hid him, and through a long series of events, basically, Pharaoh's daughter adopted him. And he was raised as a prince of Egypt. But he made some choices and essentially killed somebody, became a fugitive, and fled Egypt, and then spent time as a shepherd in the desert. So he was a prince in Egypt for 40 years, then a shepherd in the desert for 40 years. And then in Exodus chapter 3, God appears to him in the burning bush. And this is where we get Moses' call. And Moses encounters the bush, and God says, "Moses, take your sandals off, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." And Moses had this encounter with God that would change his life. And it was one of those, he could either go one way or the other, but his life would never be the same after this encounter. And so God tells Moses, he says, "I've heard the cries of my people." See, the Israelites were enslaved to the Egyptians and had been for 400 years. So God said, "I heard it. I have compassion. I am not being dismissive to them." God tells Moses, "I want you to go and lead them. Take them out of captivity. Lead them into the promised land." God promises Moses, hey, the leaders will accept you. It's going to be hard. There's going to be difficulties. I'm going to show my mighty hand, but you're going to be able to do this. Then Moses asks a question that's pretty legitimate. He says, who should I say sent me? And God identifies himself. And this is the first time God identifies himself in the Bible. He says, I am who I am. Essentially what God is doing is he's using the verb to be to describe himself, because he's eternal. There's nothing else that compares. He always was, always is, and always will be. So God is saying the I am sent you. That is the commission, that is the call that Moses had. So his life can be split up into 3 sections: the 40 years of the Prince of Egypt, the 40 years of a shepherd in the desert, and then he's got the next 40 years that he's got to decide what he's going to do. Now, he doesn't know he has 40 more years, but that's how his life is split. But in chapter 4, Moses has more dialogue in this moment of calling, and he protests. God had already told him that the leaders are going to accept you, but Moses asks God, says, what if they don't believe me or listen to me? What if they say the Lord never really appeared to you? And the Lord asked Moses, what is that in your hand? And Moses said, it's a shepherd's staff. God told him, throw the staff on the ground. So Moses threw the staff on the ground, and it turned into a snake. As you can imagine, Moses jumped back in fear. But God told him, reach out and grab its tail. Moses reached out, grabbed its tail, and it turned back into a staff. The Lord told him, perform this sign. Then they will believe that the God of their ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, really has appeared to you. Now put your hand inside your cloak. So Moses put his hand inside his cloak. When he pulled his hand out, it was white as snow with leprosy. Again, God said, put your hand inside your cloak. Moses put his hand inside his cloak. When he pulled it out this time, it was as healthy as the rest of his body. So the Lord told him, if they are not convinced by the first sign, they will be convinced by the second sign. If they still don't believe you or listen to you, take some water from the Nile River and pour it on the ground. When you do, the water from the Nile will turn to blood on the ground. So Moses, his protest, his initial question here in Exodus chapter 4 is a reasonable one. He's saying, why are they going to believe me? What if they don't believe me? What if they question me? Now, we do remember God had already told Moses, they will accept you. They will come to you. They will trust you and allow you to be their leader. But one of the things is we see that Moses is rejecting God's assurances. But we also recognize the context in which he's living. For 40 years, he's a prince of Egypt. For 40 years, he was a shepherd in the wilderness, in the desert. So he had not really spent time with these people, and he's just going to show up and say, hey, God sent me to lead you. That's kind of full of himself, isn't it? Right? So we can if we take God out of the equation, we can understand why this might be a little difficult for Moses to say, well, yeah, no problems. This will be smooth sailing. We won't have any issues with that. So what Moses is wanting is more than just God's verbal affirmation that God says it's going to be okay. He wants something more, so God gives it to him. So he uses the staff. And if you're familiar with Moses' story, that staff plays a pretty pivotal role. Not as though the staff is intrinsically valuable, but God uses the staff to bring his wonders, to bring his glory and miracles. But for Moses, as a shepherd in the wilderness, the staff was a pretty important tool to help guide the sheep and keep them safe, and also keep them safe from predators or things that might attack. So it was an essential tool that every shepherd had, but it was a pretty basic thing. Now I do want to caution us. When I think of a shepherd's staff, I just think of like a walking stick that you happen to come across. Ooh, this is a nice walking stick as you're walking through the trees, right? Now, I mean, like this was a legitimate piece of wood that was sturdy, that was strong, that could help defend against predators. But it was still common. It was still ordinary. It was still something that could easily be broken. It was not a weapon of war. It was just a common shepherd's staff. And as I think about how God used Moses and his staff, it makes me think, what do I have that's common that God can use? Now, the Sunday school answer is, well, anything, right? I mean, my point is, we need to recognize just because something is common doesn't mean God can't use it. The common things God can do wonders through. Well, then we have the second sign where Moses' hand gets leprosy and then God cures it. Now, leprosy was a pretty big deal back then. I mean, anybody who has leprosy now, it's a big deal. But there's treatments and medicines that they can take now that they didn't have back then. And it was one of those diseases that it is contagious from person to person, but most people actually can't get it. I think it's like 90% of people actually would not contract it if they came in contact with somebody who has leprosy. But those who do or can get it, it's a big deal and it causes major problems in their life. In fact, it was such a big deal that in biblical times, anyone who had leprosy would be excommunicated from the rest of the group. They'd have to go live out by themselves, maybe with other lepers. There wasn't really much that they could do to actually cure it, and so it was really just, that's life. So having leprosy, showing that God could cleanse it, could purify, could heal it, was a way that Moses could say something that is defiled can be purified. Just because something is contaminated doesn't mean God can't use it. Just like the staff, it makes me think, what's in my life that God needs to purify? We're not perfect. And I'm not trying to get up here and say that we are or I am or anything of that nature, but we need to make sure that the purification that we need, we go to God. Pride gets in the way often. Our ability to think we can fix it ourselves gets in the way. But God wants to purify and cleanse us. And then the third sign is that of the water to blood. And I find this just a real interesting imagery because both are life-giving. We need water. Right? Water is essential to function and exist as a human being. But water also does other things. It helps grow crops. It waters our lawns if you're into that. We live on the Mississippi, so it's not as big as it used to be. But traveling and trading through waterways is something that is essential and has been part of our world for most of history. So water is important, but blood's important as well. You can't live without blood. And humans, animals have blood in their bodies that give them life and help them live. And for Egypt, the Nile was the life center, lifeblood of their world. The Nile would flood in the delta, and it would bring nutrients to the soil so they could grow crops, and they had bountiful crops because of that. And it was just, the Nile that was it. That was the big deal. They all lived along the Nile. The Nile was just the most important geographical feature of Egypt. And so by Moses doing this, it was a way that God can say he can control what gives life. He can control what can help us, what can hurt us. But in this the staff and the leprosy healing, both of those seem to benefit Moses a little bit. His staff, that's his, and so he can kind of wield some power there. The leprosy was he received personal healing from it. But the water to blood, there's no benefit for Moses. And so we see that Moses in this miracle is simply an agent of God. There is nothing in it for Moses. There's no hidden agenda. It is Moses being an agent of God, which is, I think, what we need to make sure we recognize we're called to be. We're called to be agents of God. We're called to be people who proclaim who God is, His power, His might, His transforming work, all of those things. But in the midst of this, Moses still was not convinced. And so he pleaded to God. He says, "Oh Lord, I am not very good with words, and I never have been. I get tongue-tied, and my words get easily tangled." So the Lord asked Moses, "Who makes a person's mouth? Who decides if people speak or do not speak, hear or do not hear, see or do not see? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will be with you as you speak, and I will instruct you in what to say." So Moses argues now. as opposed to just asking a question, he wants to make sure that God has thought of every possible angle. Hey, God, I don't know if you remember this, but I don't speak well. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous when you actually have an outside perspective, but giving excuses to God is kind of what we do, right? People are real good at that. Oh, God, I don't know. This might come up, this might go wrong, this might happen. We have all these things that come to mind of why we think maybe that's not the best situation. Now again, if we think from Moses' perspective, or we look at it, we take God out of the equation, we think, all right, remember Moses, he wasn't really part of the group, doesn't really have much connection to the Israelites, but it's also a little strange if he had some type of speech impediment. For the first 40 years of his life, he lived in luxury. Anything he needed, he had access to as a prince of Egypt. Egypt was one of, if not the most powerful nation in the world. They had riches beyond means, and if there was a need in the royal family, they could find a way to get it. Had the best speech therapists, had the best teachers, educators, philosophers. So not only did Moses have access to things that might help him like get over a speech impediment, but also, he was well learned. He had information. He could function within that society. But God's response, it's like he's starting to get a little agitated. He's like dealing with a child who he can't get motivated. That's kind of the mental picture I get. Not that I have any experience with that, but Moses giving this excuse, and God's like, I created you. That speech issue you have, I made that. Right? That didn't just pass by without me knowing. I mean, when you think of the ridiculous nature of this, God's like, I'm the one in charge of how you function. That's it. I know your limitations. I know what the issues are. I know why that may or may not be a legitimate excuse. And so what I feel God is saying, he's reminding Moses that where Moses is deficient, God will deliver. God will provide. God will make it work, whatever it is. This didn't get missed by God. It's not one of those things where God's like, oh, I totally forgot about that. Scratch that. I'll find somebody else. God's not convinced by that because he's the creator. He knows everything. So all those details are at the forefront of who God is and how he interacts with us. But still, Moses is still not convinced. So he pleads with God again. He says, please, Lord, send anyone else. Anyone. He's like, just not me. Anybody else but me is who he's asking God to send. Then the Lord became angry with Moses. He said, all right, what about your brother Aaron the Levite? I know he speaks well. And I don't think there's actually any sarcasm written in the text, but I feel this next line from God is sarcastic. And he says, look, he's already on the way to meet you. Like Moses just told God, hey, I don't speak well. And God's like, what about your brother Aaron? Oh, he's already on his way to meet you. What are the odds of that happening? My goodness, I just love it when things work out. I don't really think that's what God said or how he said it, but I'm sure he wanted to. I'm sure that's just kind of, he was frustrated with him. And so God said, I will be with you as you speak, and I will instruct you what to do. Aaron will be your spokesman to the people, and he will be your mouthpiece, and you will stand in the place of God telling him what to say. So take your shepherd's staff and perform the miraculous signs that I've shown you. I've always wondered of what was going through Moses' mind when he asked God to send someone else. There are several things. He may have been like, oh, I don't want to exert the effort, God. Just send somebody else. He may have thought of, I've got all these responsibilities. I'm taking care of my father-in-law's sheep. And God, in-laws, that's a pretty precarious relationship sometimes. I can't just abandon this. I can't say, hey, God appeared to me, I got to go. Right? He had all these things. He had a wife. He had kids. He had all these things going for him. And yet God said, go. I wonder if he may have just been overwhelmed. God had appeared to him in a burning bush. The bush was burning but wasn't burning up. And God was speaking to him. He had to take his sandals off. Pretty intense situation. Not just your everyday run-of-the-mill conversation. It was a conversation with God, so he may have been overwhelmed. I've also wondered if he had a greater understanding for the depth of the sacrifice that this was calling him to make. We revere Moses today. He wasn't perfect. He made mistakes. But, we think of Moses, he's at least on the Mount Rushmore of the Old Testament. Right? That's who Moses is. That's who we think of him today. But the sacrifices that were required of him to be obedient to God were beyond intense. He had to stand before Pharaoh and say, let all these slaves go. These 1 to 2 million people that are free labor, let them go. And he had to stand there and bring God's wrath on the most powerful nation in the world. He had to lead these 1 to 2 million people and through an area in a way that he had never really known how to do. He faced very difficult situations where he was almost killed and trapped, and people were frustrated with him constantly. I wonder if he had a deeper grasp of the sacrifices that God was calling him to make and just wasn't wanting to do that. But even though God was angry, he was still gracious. And that's one of the things about God that just sometimes surprises me. He can be mad at us, but still extend his love and his grace. So he's frustrated with Moses, says, I've got this. He's just trying to convince Moses, just trust me. I've got a way that this is going to work. So his grace comes through even when he's frustration. See, God allows questions. Moses is asking all these questions. God was not intimidated by the questions Moses asked, because nothing surprised God. So when we go to God with our questions, with our doubts, with our concerns, it doesn't surprise God. He doesn't forbid us to do that, but there comes a point where we have to obey. We have to quit asking questions, we have to quit raising objections, and we just have to get our act together and say, God, I'm going to follow you. There comes a point where we have to do that. There's just comes a point where we have to believe that God delivers where we are deficient. Aaron was already on his way. He was coming to meet Moses. They were going to have a reunion. Aaron had everything that Moses seemed to lack. Aaron had spent his entire life with the Israelite community as a slave. He was there. He had spent his whole life there. He had clout with him. He had leadership. But he also was able to speak well, whatever that necessarily meant. Aaron provided what Moses needed. It's because God knew the plan. He knew what he needed in order to get Moses there, in order to free his people, in order to set his plan in motion. God knew it. So he tells Moses, take your staff. Take your ordinary, average shepherd staff, your common object, and go. See, we don't need to wait until we have our act together before we follow God. We just need to take what we have and go. We need to take the things we have, the common items we have, and just start serving and obeying. We've got excuses. We've got objections. We've got reasons that somebody else might be better qualified for whatever that may look like. But God's not looking for somebody else. He's looking for you. God is in the business of transforming this world. And it starts with us. We need to make sure we have experienced the transforming work of Jesus Christ before we can share that with others. But he tells you, take what you have and go. Share this transformation. Free the oppressed. Help those who are hurting and can't help themselves. Help those who are lost, whatever that means. That's what we're in the business of doing, of sharing this transforming work that Jesus has. But again, there comes a point where we have to quit raising objections and we have to start following. Now, I think as a pastor, it's a little easier for me because I can look back at July of 2003 and say, God called me to be a pastor right then and there. I remember it vividly. But anybody who knows Jesus has been called. Wherever you are, God has called you. Now He may be calling you to something different. It's real easy for us to get comfortable and say, I can pay the bills. I can support good causes. I can give to the church. I can volunteer here and there and do all those types of things. Things are okay. I've got a pretty good life. Well, that's what Moses had. Moses had a family. He had a job. He had comfort. He had convenience. He had stability. But God said, I want you to do something different. Now this morning, I'm not necessarily calling each and every one of you to quit your job and go do something different. But I think we need to be open to the possibility that God might be doing that. Because we look at our world, we find hurting, we find destruction, we find difficulty, we find people who are lost in supporting causes that have no eternal benefit. Jesus is calling us not to get caught up in what the world values, but to get caught up in the eternal purpose that we can have through Him. God has called you, and it's not to sit on your hands. It's not to be complacent. God has called you to be His people in this world. Some of you may have callings that are like Moses, where it's this grand, epic adventure. But whether it's an epic adventure or a normal, boring life, it's still the same God. And if God's in it, the boring life isn't boring. The common becomes extraordinary. We can change the world, not because of us, but because of God. God delivers where we are deficient. We recognize that where we are as people is a place that's full of inadequacies, of imperfections, of things that just aren't as perfect as they should be. But God delivers. So I don't know where God is calling you. Maybe you're exactly where God wants you to be. I say that not to give you an out, but to recognize that God continues to speak into us. So even if you're where God wants you to be, He's still speaking to you. So as we close this morning, we'll sing Graves in the Garden again. To me, that's just a reminder of affirmation that no matter who I was, God can change me. No matter what I lack, God can provide. No matter what my deficiency is, God can deliver.